Welcome to Season 5 of the Two Texts podcast. My name is David Harvey, and I'm here with my co-host, John Andrews. And this season, we're talking about the book of Jonah. Every episode will look at one text in Jonah before invariably leading us to talk about two texts, and often many more.
Hi, David. Well, in our last podcast, my goodness, we pushed in a little bit to the sort of psalm-like feel of Jonah's prayer and how that could have just slotted nicely into the Psalms or the Tehillim, and just you wouldn't know any difference in the connection there. And also the allusions, the potential allusions of Jonah's prayer that actually tap into the Psalms. He may actually be reaching for imagery within the Psalms that reflect his own experience. But I loved how we finished last time, where it was a finish where salvation belongs to the Lord. That actually, in the midst of the darkness, in the midst of the hopelessness, actually it is salvation that belongs to the Lord. And ultimately, of course, we would see that salvation in a New Testament context not only as an action of God, but the Lord himself. He is salvation, and he is our He is our hope. So I really love that sort of reflection in the context. That's so beautiful.
But of course, Jonah's salvation is really interesting. We sort of skirted around this a little bit for the last few episodes. But there's a way to read this wherein he's being saved from the belly of a fish. But what's interesting really is that Jonah doesn't describe his situation as the belly of a fish. He describes it as the belly of Sheol, right?
He does.
My goodness, what do you want to say about Sheol? We tend to, I think, lazily call it hell. And then whenever we use the word hell, we apply a lot of sort of imagery from, the kind of last 1,000 years rather than the Old Testament to sort of develop that. But this sort of dark, shadowy space, which is my goodness, it's probably closer to the Greek notion of Hades and the underworld than our notion of kind of fiery pits that we've developed probably from Dante and things like that. So, we tend to think of heaven and hell as the final spaces of the dead. Sheol is way less defined than that in Scripture, isn't it? But it's not a good place. It's a place of almost non-existing existence, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That sense of underworld, or even in the broadest sense, grave.
Yes.
That sort of, I think it describes it nicely, is that sense of, I liked sort of your language around that sort of dead, but an existence within that.
Yes.
And of course you see, even in the New Testament, is Jesus' allusion to the rich man and Lazarus. Does he lead into the sort of context of what might look like an understanding of Sheol from a Hebrew world? And you have that sort of compartment of the righteous and that sort of almost place of suffering. But you get this sense of he's descended into something beyond, something that feels like death, something that feels like the grave. So is he describing experience that feels like death, or is he actually, what's an interesting reflection? Has he died? Has he actually entered into Sheol, in that sense that in some way he's entered that underworld, that afterlife, that grave world, and therefore he's dead? I think, like, undoubtedly in the story of Jonah, you have, even without the New Testament reflection on this, which is incredibly specific, you do have a resurrection motif at the very least. There's a resurrection vibe to the experience of Jonah. He's swallowed into the fish. I love, we've alluded to it many, many times, and I love how the Hebrew sort of puts it, but you've got the sort of belly of the fish, but the abdomen of Sheol. And it really is interesting language. It feels like the belly of the fish feels like, there's a chance I can get out of here, but the abdomen of Sheol feels like, hold on a minute, I'm in another place entirely here. I'm in the digestive system of Sheol. I'm being
Yes.
consumed, and my life is either. I mean, his language later on, he uses my life as ebbing or fainting. My soul is ebbing or fainting. Um, but that sense in which his soul, his life, his nefesh is being consumed in the abdomen of Sheol. So
Yes.
you get a very interesting little reflective thought and conversation. Is he dead, or is he in a dying like experience? And of course, it can have very powerful implications on how we read the story and how we understand even Jesus' reading of the story.
Yes. Yeah. If is Jesus drawn to the 3 days and 3 nights because the Hebrew reader interprets this as a death and resurrection? I mean, I've kind of tried to settle on the fact that Jonah almost doesn't know for sure. But of course, I mean, you see that in most of the literature that you have from the time period about Sheol. The people there don't really know what's happening to them. You know, the rich man and Lazarus, right? He's still kind of stuck, acting like the rich man, but also kind of stuck in this space where he has no control. For Jonah, what's curious to me is that he cries out from the belly of Sheol, from the abdomen, as you said, the sort of innermost parts of Sheol. Curiously, of course, let's come back to this, but the Lord still hears him.
Indeed.
But notice verse 7. Actually, verse 6. I went down to the land whose bars closed upon me forever. Right.
Yes.
So he went, and yet you brought my life up from the pit. Right.
Yes.
That's really interesting language. And then verse 7. My life was ebbing away. Right. So at very least, Jonah. I mean, we've probably overplayed this by now, but he's not sat with a little table and a lamp, Pinocchio style, in the belly of this fish. Like if he is not dead, he thinks he's dying, right?
Yes.
But his language of being in the pit, of being in the land whose bars are closed forever. I mean, to me, I think Jonah, at least in his expression of this prayer, thinks it's game over.
Yes, completely. And even that language of the bars, there is an understanding that sort of the bars were the gateway, the entranceway into Sheol. In some of those references, I mean, I think even Job alludes to this. So in Job 17, Job says, you get this reference. I say to corruption, you are my father, and to the worm, my mother, my sister. Where then is my hope? Is Job in his moment of terrible desperation. And he goes on to say, who can see any hope for me? Will it go down to the gates of Sheol? Will it go down to the bars of Sheol? Will we descend together into the dust? So even the language of Jonah in terms of the bars is another reference of this sort of, he feels like he's either has or he feels like he has entered this underworld. He has entered into death. He's entered into the grave. So it's very, very interesting in terms of that sort of, I think, dynamic that there is a death-like experience that he is experiencing, whether he knows it or not and is struggling to explain it, or whether Jonah has literally died and then is, as it were, resurrected. It then throws a very interesting spin on the story and allows us to read the story potentially a little bit differently than a man.
Yes.
If we want to lean into the idea of being swallowed by a great fish, surviving the 3 days in the fish, where actually, if there's a sense in which he's swallowed and he dies, and what we've got is the prayer as he calls out from Sheol itself, that the Lord's then act of salvation is even more dramatic for this man in drawing him back to not only planet Earth, but to life itself.
Yes, and I think that's I think a better reading of a text in its ancient context, because I think I think even as modern people who believe in spiritual things, there's a tendency for us to think very much black and white. This person is alive, now they're dead, and because they're dead, they're now in a spiritual realm. You see this ancient idea of this being far much thinner in its divide of blending between both what we would call physical life and the afterlife. And so, at least in an ancient context, what Jonah's saying, it's still miraculous. Like, I'm not trying to underplay that at all, but it feels less necessary for them to articulate exactly what's happening here. I think an ancient person reads, my life was brought up from the pit, and thinks, oh, like this is a miraculous. It's not just miraculous that Jonah is eaten by a whale. It's that Jonah dies. And I mean, can I be ridiculous, John, and almost say that if it wasn't for our modern readings of the miraculous, this story would almost only be read the way that we're thinking. So we would read this story as a man was thrown into the sea and eaten by a whale, and he died. And then the Lord brings him back from death, and the fish vomits him up, and he is brought back to life. Right? Like that's almost a more naturally supernatural reading of the story than the way we tend to read it, that this fish swallows him and he just sits bored for 3 days, waiting to get out. But funnily enough, that's the reading in the modern world, maybe because of the Sunday school stories we tend towards having, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And it is, when we then reflect on how Jesus reflects on the story, it's an interesting, it is an interesting sort of read. I think there are two references that the Gospels collect of Jesus' statement, the one in Matthew and the one in Luke. And it's interesting how Jesus uses both of those stories. In terms of the Matthew one, I think for me what was striking, so I think it's in Matthew 12. And the context is the Pharisees and teachers of the law want a miraculous sign from Jesus. And he says, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. But then it says this, it goes on to say, the men of Nineveh will stand up at the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for they repented at the preaching of Jonah. Now, I think what's really interesting there, that Jesus is connecting himself to Jonah. We know Jesus dies.
Yes.
Right? He's not swallowed by the earth and is just sleeping in the earth. He dies. He gave up the spirit and died. So Jesus connects him, and his audience don't push back on that illusion. His audience don't push back on that idea. It seems to be an accepted idea in terms of Jonah's experience, that you've got this, that he dies. And then, of course, you get this idea that actually the men of Nineveh will condemn this generation because of their response to Jonah after his resurrection. And again, the Lucan version seems to allude to that. So if you look at Luke, I think it's chapter 11, and we've got this sort of context, and it's a similar context. This wicked generation asks for a sign. It asks for a miraculous sign, but none will be given except the sign of Jonah. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so will be the Son of Man to this generation. Now, in what way was Jonah the sign to the Ninevites? You could argue it's the sign that he's been delivered from the fish. That actually, that's the sign that this prophet who was swallowed has now been delivered, and this is sort of the sign. So it's almost like Jesus is using the resurrection of Jonah and his resurrection as a sort of a similar conversation in terms of how that will be used. It was used to save the Ninevites, but it will be used in some ways to judge the generation that rejects Jesus at his resurrection. I mean, I'm trying I'm trying to understand how Jesus uses the sort of the Jonah story. But it seems to me that Jesus is suggesting, I'm going to die and rise. And he's connecting the fact that Jonah was in the belly of the fish. Is it Jonah dead in the fish and therefore in the abdomen of Sheol? Or is he miraculously delivered alive? And I think you pay your money and take your choice sort of thing. I think there's a pull and push on it.
I mean, it's interesting. Even you alluded to the Luke 16, the rich man and Lazarus. I mean, I again, just spinning off what you're saying, I think it's fascinating that the person's name is Lazarus in this story, given that in John's gospel we have a Lazarus who is raised from the dead. But what the rich man asks for is for someone to, like, for Abraham to send Lazarus back and warn everyone. And the response on the lips of Jesus as he tells the story is, if they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, right, of which Jonah is one of them, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. You hold that echo of that sentence from Jesus in mind with his comment then about the Ninevites, you know, who listened to Jonah, but these people won't, as the sign of Jonah. There's this Jesus-like reference to how, number one, that these miraculous signs are not what the substance of faith is made of, which I think is really interesting. But this resistance to the resurrecting work of God amongst his own people, which is interesting given that even in Jonah's prayer, as he's crying out to God, he's still resisting the Ninevites a little bit, and yet they become the marker of the way to be, actually, on the lips of Jesus. It's really interesting to read as a Christian, to like, my goodness, these people that Jonah doesn't like, that God cares for, are actually become the model of faith in the face of those who want to resist resurrection.
Yeah. No, I see that, and again, and Jesus seems to be using that in a very, very pointed way. In an understanding of what has happened to Jonah. So it's a fascinating conversation. This realm of the dead being he calls out from that realm of the dead. He's literally crying out from the depths, hurled into the depths. All of this sort of constant language of this idea of being brought up from the pit could be language simply of illusion, but of course may also see this. And again, a little reference we made to the last in the last podcast, I want to come back to, David, but you get a lovely Jonah and Jesus echo. Well, not so much an echo with Jesus, it's explicitly linked, actually. But you get a Jonah echo and a Jesus link to Psalm 16. Psalm 16, because you will not abandon me, or literally my soul, to the realm of the dead, nor let your faithful one see decay. So actually in Psalm 16, you've got, I mean, Paul and Peter pick that reference up when speaking of Jesus in the book of Acts. So you've got in Acts chapter 2, verse 31, Peter referencing that in his sermon, and Paul references it again in Acts 13, 35. So again, you've got this incredible, that Jesus wasn't, as it were, abandoned to Sheol. He wasn't abandoned to the realm of the dead, but actually God in his faithfulness raised him up so that he would not see decay. And I think, again, the language connects to Jonah because he's the one in the realm of the dead, and he's the one who ultimately gets vomited up and delivered. Salvation is from the Lord, and he gets rescued. So I do think that even Psalm 16 makes a possible connection to this idea of death and resurrection as a way of reading Jonah, not just of sort of miraculous provision of a man alive in the belly of the great fish. So to me, that language of belly and abdomen is really, really significant. I can't get away from it. I'm probably overcooking it, but it's that sense of the not allowing not allowing the Holy One of the faithful and see decay, alluding to Jesus, but also an echo of Jonah. It sounds like Jonah's experience, but it's definitely connected to Jesus' experience by the early church.
It's interesting. Then the other place very obvious place that I was drawn is Psalm 139, which I think you should just keep layering on top of this conversation we've got on. So I really love what you've pointed out there. I mean, that's, like you say, it's such a key verse for the New Testament writers, that Jesus is not abandoned to the realm of the dead. Psalm 139 almost wants to make the point that God doesn't want to abandon anyone to that place. Like, even if I make my bed. I mean, the NIV obscures this a little bit, but so where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, NIV has, but it's Sheol so if I make my bed in Sheol, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea. I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it? Even there, your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast. I say, surely the darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me. But even darkness is not dark to you. The night will shine like the day. The darkness is as light to you. But then he says, and this is just kind of fun, you created my inmost being. You knit me together in the abdomen of my mother, in the baton, you say. That sort of word reappears. So there's this kind of Jonah's crying from the baton of Sheol, but the Psalm 139 makes like, there is no space I've ever been that you cannot hear me, know me, and see me. And so we're tracking with very dominant themes of Old Testament that the New Testament writers are picking up and pointing out the Lord's faithfulness to Jesus by doing exactly what Scripture has always confessed. And I wonder if is that what's in Jonah, to be able to say that he can cry out from the pit. He can cry out from the place of death and the dead, and his life is ebbing away. That prayer, and I think this is, to me, I mean, what's really interesting is, notice in verse 7 of Jonah 2, as my life, my nephesh, my soul. So think about what you said. Back over there in Psalm 16. So as my soul is drifting, I remembered Adonai and my tefillah, right? So it's my psalm at some level, isn't it? You may want to riff off on that. I'd love for you to do that. But that comes to your holy temple. But it's his tefillah. I mean, that's fun, isn't it?
It is. And again, absolutely connects it to this whole idea of these prayers. So if you were looking for an explicit link to the sort of Tehillim and the Tefillah, I mean, you've got it right there. So this is something that comes sort of out of his depths with that, and I think that sort of reflects that so beautifully in that sort of language that he uses in that section of the prayer that you reflect on, and I loved even the end of Psalm 139 that you alluded to before coming back to Jonah. Right at the end, of course, of the psalm, it says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts, and see if there's any grievous way within me, and then lead me to the way everlasting," which is, a beautiful allusion of God's life. Again, this idea of God's provision of life within that. So there's almost, again, that connection to some of the beautiful allusions of Psalm 139. The end of that psalm is the searching of the person, to search not only am I made in the, as it were, the womb and woven in the womb, but Lord, you can see the very depths of my being. You can see even within me who I am, and search me and try me. And there's a sense in which then, Jonah is in the abdomen of Sheol. He is being searched. He's being tried. as it were. It's as if the Lord is searching out the grievous way within him in order to give him an opportunity to come to a place of acceptance of that, and a crying out to God that will enable or allow, saying that very reverently and very carefully, to allow the Lord to bring that life everlasting, that salvation, that deliverance.
It's not occurred to me until I'm sat looking at it with you right now as well, that just building on the parallels we're drawing, you've got this section of Psalm 139, where can I go? That allusion. So we can see at the start of Jonah's tefillah, at the start of Jonah's psalm, there's this, I can cry out even from the pit and you will hear me. That's very similar to, where can I go from your spirit? Even in my mother's belly, you were aware of me. And then you've got the end that you've just pointed out, that there's this kind of salvation belongs to the Lord, the being led in the way everlasting, the search me and know my heart. The little bit of Psalm 139 between those two ideas is actually a rejection of those that hate the Lord. That, Lord, you would come against your enemies, that you would, that your enemies are my enemies. And it's interesting then that, like, we've critiqued Jonah a little bit for the fact that even at this bad point in the life, he's like, those who worship vain idols forsake their true loyalty. Ironically enough, Psalm 139, in all of its praise, has a little word for the people that don't love the Lord. So Jonah may be even modeling that psalmic form even more than we know. That to us, it looks a little bit like, why are you in the belly of the fish still throwing shade on your enemies? He may be almost unconsciously echoing Psalm 139, echoing Psalm 16, and feels the need to name his loyalty in the face of another. Of course, the irony of it becomes when the Lord is revealed in Jonah, he just wants people to come to him, and he cares even for the Ninevites. But to this point, there's Jonah's tracking the worship of Israel, isn't he?
He is. Absolutely. And again, he in that sort of, I was looking at that worthless idols sort of statement, that it can almost be translated empty folly or false witness, something that is empty of substance, empty of truth, empty of, so he's setting himself up and saying, well, his words there, those who cling to worthless idols turn away from God's love for them, but I, with shouts of grateful praise, will sacrifice to you. That's just a dynamic echo back to the sailors. The sailors sacrifice and made vows. I think we may have alluded to that before.
Yes.
But if you look at Jonah's words in verses 8 to 10, ironically, he's sort of having a go at the world of the sailors, or the world of the Ninevites, the world of the Goyim, the world of the Gentile. And yet, ironically, though he's saying that I will shout praises, will sacrifice to you, and what I have vowed I will make good, actually, the sailors have already done that as well. So interestingly, though, he's setting up this contrast of himself as a good follower of Yahweh, as opposed to those who follow worthless idols. Ironically, he highlights the idea that those who previously followed worthless idols did exactly the same thing that Jonah is now promising to do. And they did it by the end of the story. They sacrificed to Yahweh, and they made vows to the Lord. And Jonah is doing that. So if you get this incredible, I think there's a double edge to that, David. There's a real ironic double edge to that he's, in some ways, he's saying, Lord, I will sacrifice to you. I will remember my vows. I'll come back to doing what I'm supposed to be doing. But in comparing himself to the Gentile world, ironically, he's throwing our attention back to a group of people who went, oh, actually, they did that, Jonah. They responded to the voice of the Lord. They responded to the storm. They responded to what they saw Yahweh do, and they themselves also sacrificed and made vows to the Lord, whatever that is. which of course then sort of sets us up for what is about to happen in Nineveh. So I love the humor of that. I love the irony of that, the satire of that you get a sense that in trying to make himself look better, Jonah is actually alluding to the fact that those who wouldn't be expected to sacrifice or make their vows have done so unto the Lord.
Well, I mean, it's beautifully ironic, isn't it, that Jonah calls out to the Lord, makes vows to the Lord, comes round to what the Lord asked him, but he's second to all of these points from the very people that he's still criticizing. It's like they called out before him, they made vows before him, they listened before him, they even figured out what was going on before him.
So true. So true.
And there's this, I think this is, we've done this deep dive in the last few episodes into the psalm that Jonah, the prayer that Jonah gives us. But what you've just named there draws us back out into the big irony of Jonah, that even still in all of that, Jonah can't see that. He can't see the irony of him naming all these things, which are all profoundly true, but he's coming to them later. Later than the very people that he thinks don't deserve the salvation that ultimately, and this is the key thing in the prayer, the salvation that belongs not to Jonah, but it belongs to the Lord.
So good, so good, so good. And as if to sort of ram that magnificent point home, the story in chapter 2 finishes with, this gorgeous, and the Lord spoke to the fish, and it vomited Jonah out onto the dry land. You get this amazing, in the midst of, even though by the time we get to the end of the prayer, it's still a bit edgy. It was all moving in a beautiful direction of repentance and return, all of that gorgeous stuff. Gets a wee bit edgy at the end. But it seems the Lord has searched Jonah. The Lord has tried Jonah. The Lord has tested Jonah's heart. And actually, the Lord, in his gracious salvation, speaks to the fish so that Jonah will be saved from the abdomen of Sheol, from the belly of the fish, or from the watery grave. Whatever happened to Jonah, dead or alive, he's now delivered, not because he escaped, but because the Lord, who is salvation, and the Lord to whom salvation belongs, spoke to the fish, and said, okay, loose him, let him out, vomit him back unceremoniously onto the dry land. And you just get this amazing, magnificent picture of a man who doesn't look like he's experienced the grace of God, as he's covered in the inner workings of that great fish, covered in slime and whatever else was going on. But actually, we see in that bedraggled man, we see the gracious, faithful, loving kindness and salvation of the Lord, who delivered him from Sheol and gave him, quite genuinely, a second chance to go and do what he ought to do.
And what's maybe worth noticing in the way that you framed this for us is that the Lord speaks to the fish, and then, as we'll find out next time at the start of chapter 3, then the Lord calls to Jonah and speaks to him, the same word as he says to the fish. And it just, as you were saying that just then, it struck me that Jonah comes second to call out to the Lord, second to make his vows, second to realize what's going on. And the Lord speaks to him second after speaking to the fish.
Yes, it's amazing. And of course, what's wonderful, as we shall pick up next time, is that this time, like the fish, Jonah listens and begins his journey to the great city of Nineveh.
That's all from Jonah and us for this episode. Keep diving into the text yourself and enjoying this wonderful book of the Bible. We'd love it if you rated, reviewed, or shared this episode with a friend. And we also want to say thank you to all of our listeners who financially support the show, sharing the weight of producing the podcast with us. If you'd like to support the show, visit twotexts.com and follow the instructions from there. We'll be back soon with a new episode, but until then, from us, goodbye.